Upon her reveal all the way back in issue 8, Whisper quickly became a fan favorite character in the IDW comics. She had a cool design, and the whispering gimmick made it clear pretty much immediately that there was something more going on with her. And we got to see what that more was pretty quickly, with the Tangle and Whisper miniseries giving us a lot of details about Whisper's backstory. This was also the miniseries that introduced Mimic, the source of Whisper's trauma, and just overall a real piece of work. In the years since then, there's been a lot of discussion about these characters and what makes them work, or occasionally why some people think that they may not work. Still, the overall reception of these characters has been very positive, and there have even been some videos here on YouTube talking about these characters in more detail. However, with the recently released 2024 annual, we got a lot of more insight into exactly who Mimic is, and this annual paints his entire character in a completely new light. The story that at first seemed so simple has now been made much more complicated, and personally, I love what this annual did for Mimic's character and through him, what we can learn about Whisper. But before we can get to any of that and explain why this annual is just so revealing, we have to talk about who these characters are and why this particular story matters so much. This story actually begins quite a while before the beginning of the comic, during the Eggman War. This particular story centers on the Diamond Cutters, a group of 5 mercenaries who are some of the best at what they do. These guys have been through thick and thin together, and among them are the 2 characters in question, Whisper and Mimic. After spending who knows how long fighting together, likely months at the very least, there's one mission that goes very differently. Uncharacteristically, Mimic actually leads the charge this time, giving the Diamond Cutters all the info they need about the upcoming mission. The team's psychic, Clairvoyant, tells Whisper to hang back, sensing that something's not quite right. During the mission, Mimic goes off on his own, using his shape-shifting abilities to blend into Eggman's robots, which is something he did frequently. However, just a few moments later, the Diamond Cutters are ambushed. The doors lock around them, and shadow androids attack. And the Diamond Cutters are killed while Whisper, using the masks their engineer made, watches on in horror. As it turns out, Mimic had backstabbed them, using their lives as a bargaining chip to get on Eggman's good side. Whisper disappears, seeing Mimic's true colors for the first time. Mimic, unable to confirm that Whisper is dead as Eggman had asked him to do, devises a plan to trick Eggman by turning in her weapon. Unfortunately for Mimic, he doesn't get off scot-free as Whisper doesn't disappear forever. Whisper returns to the battlefield as the eponymous Guardian Angel, and eventually Eggman gets wise to the fact that Mimic had lied to him. Once Eggman realizes that Mimic had tricked him, he tracks down Mimic and demands that Mimic kill Whisper, or else. All of this is relayed to Tangle, Whisper's first friend since the Diamond Cutters, during the events of the miniseries, and Tangle is able to coax Whisper out of her shell a bit. The pair defeat Mimic after a few rounds of trickery, and Whisper very nearly pulls the trigger and puts Mimic down for good before Tangle is able to stop her. Instead, they put Mimic into a specialized prison designed to hold him no matter what form he takes, and decide to put all of this behind them. Of course, that's not where the story ends. Starline would eventually bust Mimic out of prison, and Mimic would go right back to his old ways. Eggman at that point still had Mimic in his sights, which Starline uses as a bargaining chip to get the octopus on his side. Near the end of the adventure, a critical plot development happens, and Mimic is able to wipe himself off of Eggman's internal servers, meaning that Eggman, at this point, essentially doesn't even know that he exists anymore. The news of Mimic's escape has a massive impact on Whisper, as she once again turns away from her friends and goes off on her own, citing the threat of Mimic as a reason that she has to go away. That doesn't really work out all that well for her, and Tangle is eventually able to convince Whisper to come back to work for the Restoration alongside the rest of her friends. Later on, this wound would get reopened by an inconsiderate comment from Tangle, and after a long talk, Whisper decides that she can't let her fear of Mimic poison her anymore, and she vows to be more open and trusting of her teammates from then on. After this heart-to-heart with Tangle and her new teammate, Lanolin, Whisper finds the strength to keep fighting against Eggman. That is a very brief rundown of these characters' history, and a lot more happens that I can't go into right now just for the sake of time. Eventually, Mimic makes himself known once again, and Whisper has a bit of a hard time actually living up to her promise, but we don't need to go into all that detail about those stories at this moment. For a long time, Whisper's story was seemingly well understood by the community. Whisper herself has said that she has a hard time trusting people after what all has happened to her. The Diamond Cutters, including Mimic, were like family to her, and seeing them all destroyed by someone that she thought she could trust completely destroyed her. The fear of losing those close to her again kept her from forming any meaningful relationships or any relationships at all for a long time, and that fear is still something she struggles with. And as much as she tries to get past that fear, it's hard to leave it behind because Mimic is still out there. The threat of him returning is always there, and as we've seen more recently, it's not like she has absolutely no reason to be scared. Mimic does want to kill Whisper. There is actually someone out there that wants to hurt her, but as Whisper says, living her entire life in fear of Mimic is letting him win. Mimic, in this analysis, is the living representation of Whisper's trauma and fear. He's like a phantom, hiding behind every corner and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Anyone could be Mimic. Anyone could be out to hurt her and the things that Whisper cares about, and that adds a completely different angle to Whisper's paranoia. In a way, this feels like a literalization of the effects of trauma. When you go through a traumatic experience like this, it's easy to stop trusting anyone, to feel like no matter what you do or where you go, you'll never truly be safe from the things and the people that want to hurt you. Mimic's powers serve as the embodiment of this type of paranoia, where the feeling that anyone you meet could be a threat is turned into a literal stalker who's out to hurt you and has the skills and powers to pretend to be anyone. This was the general understanding of Whisper and Mimic's relationship that has been bandied about, and it makes a lot of sense because that's most of what we had seen from the comic up to this point. Most videos on YouTube talking about Whisper and Mimic's relationship or talking about Mimic as a character focus on how scary Mimic is. And that makes a lot of sense. Up to this point, most of what we've seen from Mimic have just highlighted how evil, ruthless, and cunning he can be. It seemed like Mimic was just an evil, heartless monster who existed basically entirely to fuck with Whisper. However, there's a lot more depth to this little tentacle boy, and I think he has the potential to be one of those interesting villains in the entire comic, and most of that potential is being set up in this one short story from the annual. This one story gives Mimic so much more depth than he had previously, and I honestly think the community at large is kinda sleeping on it. So why don't we go ahead and crack this bad boy open and see what the 2024 annual has to show us about Mimic. But before that, I do have to do the annoying YouTuber thing and ask you to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm actually really close to being able to make some money off of this channel, and if that happens, I can justify spending even more of my time making content about Sonic for you guys. The next big milestone I have to hit is 1,000 subscribers, so if you are enjoying this content at all, please consider subscribing. Anyway, I've wasted enough of your time, let's get back to the video. The basic gist of the story is that it is a retelling of Whisper's backstory from Mimic's perspective, allowing us to hear his thoughts and see why he made the choices he did. The story opens with Mimic stalking the Neo Diamond Cutters, more specifically Whisper. As he does so, we get some narration from Mimic detailing how he views the world. Throughout this story, Mimic describes how he feels that identity is essentially nothing more than an illusion. Everyone is a composite of random ideas and behaviors they've picked up from elsewhere, and on the inside, all there is the nothingness that we keep hidden under a mask. Mimic is so engrossed in this nihilistic worldview that he thinks everyone else feels the exact same way. According to Mimic, everyone knows deep down how shallow and meaningless everything is, they just refuse to acknowledge it. Or maybe they're incapable of seeing what he is. After all, Mimic's seen a lot of the brutality of life firsthand. Throughout this speech, we get glimpses into Mimic's backstory. A bit of a washed-up actor, Mimic seems to have had a pretty hard life even before the war. The others in the industry seem to, at the very least, resent him for his shape-shifting abilities, seeing them as a threat to their work and taking those frustrations out on Mimic. Later on, Mimic also notes that working with the Diamond Cutters gave him access to private lodging and high-quality clothes, and says that these were unheard of luxuries even before the war, which is a bit of a strange line. This seems to imply that he was really scraping to get by for most of his life, and was seemingly unaware of how unusual this was in the context of this comic. We don't see many characters struggling for housing or clothes, and everything in the comic is set after the Eggman War, which would have made all these things more scarce, so this line seemingly exists to imply a level of dilapidation in Mimic's past. Back to Mimic's backstory, his future as an actor is effectively ruined by Eggman's invasion. Mimic notes that having his dream crushed during a war did a number on his mental state, a note that I think we need to keep in the back of our minds, and then goes on to detail how he started working with others in fights against Eggman. Of course, he was already up to his tricks at this time, abandoning his allies if he ever felt that he was in danger. Mimic seems to have lived this way for quite some time, at least long enough to get a bit of a reputation. This reputation attracts Whisper to him, and Whisper invites him to join the Diamond Cutters. And after accepting, everything changes. Mimic notes that unlike most of his other teams, he can still remember the Diamond Cutters vividly, that they're a stain on his mind that he just can't wash out. The reasons Mimic seems to remember them are that, unlike a lot of his other teams, they're the only ones who were good enough at their job for him to stick around for very long. More importantly, all this time with the Diamond Cutters allows for Mimic's talents to finally be appreciated. This is the first group of people in a long time, or maybe ever, who saw Mimic's powers and praised him for them. And Mimic loves it. He loves the praise, and above all, the recognition and validation that the Diamond Cutters give him. It seems as if the Diamond Cutters were the closest thing that Mimic has ever had to a family. Which of course just makes his next moves all the more baffling, at least at first. As we all know, Mimic will soon betray the Diamond Cutters and hand them over to Eggman on a silver platter, and here we get to see exactly why he did so. In a flashback, Mimic remembers Whisper giving a motivational speech to the Diamond Cutters, an event that he really doesn't like remembering given his commentary. Whisper talks about how each of the Diamond Cutters, including Mimic, are so very important to her, and how much she trusts them. And this hurts him. Mimic says that if they know about his past, if they know who Mimic really is, they'll all abandon him immediately. This is a very dangerous sign to Mimic. To Mimic, this is a sign that he's become weak, that he has allowed himself to become too vulnerable. And his only solution from then on is to get rid of this vulnerability. Permanently. There is so much to dig into there, but the most immediately important thing to note is how this changes the dynamic between Whisper and Mimic. I think before this annual, a lot of people assumed that Mimic's desire to kill Whisper was a purely practical matter. Eggman wanted all of the Diamond Cutters dead and was holding that over Mimic's head, so that was his motivation for trying to get rid of her in the initial miniseries. People have kind of just ran with that in the time since, even though if you look back on it, that hasn't applied for quite a while. Ever since the incident with Starline, Mimic has been largely safe from Eggman, but we can see in his interactions with Clutch that the opossum dangles the possibility of getting back at Whisper over Mimic's head, and Mimic absolutely still has a vendetta against her. Mimic doesn't want to kill Whisper for any logical reasons, but instead because of a deep psychological desire that's grabbed a hold of him. The language of the annual really drives this point home, how the Diamond Cutters were a stain on him, how he can't be healed until he shatters every last one of them. Before this annual, a lot of the community viewed Mimic as this sort of emotionless, cunning, Machiavellian figure, but this exposes just how emotional he really is. I mean, think about it. Going after Whisper has put him in more danger over the course of this story, not less. Infiltrating the Restoration and getting so close to his target has made Mimic into a target, and that's something he probably knew was a possibility. He either decided it was worth it to kill Whisper, or maybe he was so blinded by his desire to take her out that he couldn't see how illogical he was really being. Even if he does get rid of her, her remaining friends aren't going to take Whisper's death lying down. They're going to come after him next, so no matter how you look at it, Mimic's moves here are far less safe than if he just tried to stay off the grid for a while. And the very fact that this is such a bad move for Mimic raises a lot of questions. Why is it exactly that Mimic has to get rid of all of the Diamond Cutters? Why is it so important to him that he would forgo everything else just to get rid of this blemish on his perfect mask? There are a lot of ways you can start answering these questions, but I think the most important is to start by highlighting one very simple fact. All of Mimic's behavior seems to be a way of trying to cope with his trauma. We only get glimpses of it, but Mimic clearly didn't have a great life leading up to the Eggman War. His relationship with his peers was distraught, to put it mildly, and as I said earlier, it seems as if the comic is implying that he had it very rough for most of his life, barely scraping by with the barest of necessities. This experience taught Mimic a lesson that defined the person he would become. Simply put, in this world, it's every man for himself. Mimic did what he thought he had to survive, and that included stabbing people in the back constantly. I've heard some people say that Mimic is incapable of feeling any remorse for his actions, but I don't think that that's quite true. I think it's more accurate to say that he has taught himself to not feel any remorse. He seems to understand somewhere deep down that what he's doing is wrong and is able to feel guilt for it. I mean, otherwise, why would he be so scared of the Diamond Cutters learning about his past? Sure, you could maybe argue that that's a purely logical thing, that he was worried they'd kick him out, but I don't think it would have affected him this deeply if that's all it was. I do think Mimic knows that what he's doing is wrong, at least somewhere deep down in there. He just does everything he can to hide that from himself. To cope with all those feelings, he's built up all of these beliefs. The idea that everyone is going to do to him what he's already doing, so he might as well strike first. It's a way of excusing himself of any wrongdoing, and this fragile cognition that Mimic's entire sense of identity rests upon is built on the shaky belief that everyone else thinks the way he does, even if they can't recognize it. Everyone is fake, everyone is lying, and everyone is in it for themselves. These are all lessons that Mimic learned by being tossed aside by everyone, and in turn, he's going to toss everyone else aside as well. However, like Mimic says, he is a walking contradiction. Despite believing this about others, there's nothing Mimic wanted more than recognition. He craves the approval of others, so when the Diamond Cutter started to give that to him, he couldn't help but soak it up. And at that point, Mimic's worldview started to break down. No matter how close Mimic got to his team, there was always a wall between them. Mimic still couldn't be honest with them, actually tell them the things he'd done. If he was capable of these feelings, of feeling this close to a group of people, could he be wrong about how he saw the world? What if there was more to life than the dog-eat-dog world that he'd always known? What if the things he'd done to survive weren't actually that necessary? Despite being surrounded by more people than ever, all it did was highlight how alone Mimic really was. The guilt and isolation ate at Mimic, sending him into a panic whenever these feelings were brought up. At some point, Mimic had no choice but to get rid of the Diamond Cutters. They were simply too big of a weakness. After all, they were the last things keeping him tethered to those feelings, keeping him from embracing the emptiness inside him and wearing it as a badge of honor. And now the only one left is Whisper, the only person that Mimic ever cared about besides himself that's still alive. The only way that Mimic can be free of the guilt, shame, and weakness that plagues him, is to get rid of the last reminder of what little humanity he has left. Mimic is a character consumed by fear. Fear of the things he's done and the weaknesses he's worked so hard to distance himself from. In a sense, the only person more terrified of Mimic than Whisper may be himself. With all of that said, I think it's time we turn our attention back to Whisper. The IDW comics really like to create parallels between their heroes and villains. For a quick example, let's take a look at Sonic and Eggman. The fight between these two is a battle of ideologies, and I mean that very literally. Sonic could just get the Chaos Emeralds and go supersonic to take out Eggman anytime he wants, and Eggman has said that he could carpet bomb Sonic out of existence, but that's not the point. Sonic has to prove that there's good in everyone and that freedom and redemption are the most powerful forces on the planet, and Eggman has to break Sonic and show that his way of thinking and his genius are even stronger than that. Neither is willing to budge on their ideals, even if it may be the right move from like a practical standpoint. Similarly, Whisper and Mimic have a common thread connecting them, the fact that both of their characters are mainly motivated by fear. And I think this says something potentially dark about Whisper as a character. To put it plainly, Mimic shows us who Whisper could be if she were to give in to her fear. We've seen in the past that Whisper is a lot less forgiving than most of the other heroes. She takes people as they are and isn't one to readily give second chances. The past has taught Whisper that people teach you who they are pretty quickly, and she's willing to listen to that. Now, currently, this does go both ways. I'm sure that if Surge really did start to redeem herself, Whisper would eventually come around, but what if Mimic tried to turn over a new leaf? A part of me feels that Whisper would never be able to forgive him for what he did, that she'd spend the rest of her life watching him through the scope of her gun for any little slip up. That response, that mistrust, is a result of her fear of losing the people she cares about. And it's certainly possible that this inability to trust others could get pushed even further. Maybe if things got bad enough, Whisper would give up on second chances entirely. Maybe she'd see it to it that anyone who she saw as a threat was dealt with permanently. She's been pretty close to taking people out before, it's not unthinkable. And if Whisper starts to take that first step, starts to let herself do things she'll regret to try and protect herself and others, that road is going to be far longer and far darker than she could ever imagine. It's a road that, given how she acted in issue 76 and the fact that she's once again chasing down Mimic, she might be far closer to going down than we might realize. Both Whisper and Mimic seem to have a sort of psychological compulsion to get rid of each other, and murder is an option on both of their minds. Of course, similar to Mimic, Whisper's belief that if she takes care of Mimic, then everything will be fine is just wrong. Simply put, there's no number of people Whisper can take out that would make her feel safe. That's not just because her friends like to help others, which puts them in harm's way either, but because at the end of the day, loss is a part of life. Nothing lasts forever, and the only way that you don't lose someone important to you at some point is if they lose you first. But you can't let that stop you from making those connections, because those relationships are the most important things that we have. Whisper's story isn't just about coping with trauma. It's a bit more specific than that. It's about whether or not she's going to follow in Mimic's footsteps and let her fear control who she is and the person she's going to become. And as of right now, we are frighteningly close to that happening. And that's about all I have to say for right now. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.